In the brutal stillness of February 1911, the wind swept through the canyons of Prospector's Hollow like a curse looking for a name. This was a place the maps had long forgotten, tucked beneath Colorado's frozen teeth, where men went to mine silver and bury their sins. That morning, as the sun rose sluggishly behind the ridge, a deputy named Eli Graves stepped out of the jailhouse and found something impossible lying in the snow. A girl, no older than 12, barefoot. Her dress had fused to her skin. Her hair was mostly gone. She was burned, horribly, but alive. Barely. Eli dropped to his knees, pulling off his coat and pressing it around her trembling frame. Her lips moved like they were stuck between worlds. "He's still in the fire," she whispered. "And he's smiling." Then she was gone. What chilled Eli more than the words, more than the sight of this burned child lying dead at his feet, was what she had clenched in her blackened fist. A locket. Inside was a faded sketch of a boy. 10 years old, maybe 11. Eyes wide, lips curled into a strange, serene smile, skin unnaturally pale. The image shimmered faintly, as if some old candlelight flickered behind it, despite no flame being near. Something about the boy felt wrong, timeless, as though he'd been drawn without the burden of years. Sheriff Walter Brannock would later testify that the sketch felt warmer than metal had any right to be, and that, after opening it, his fingers smelled faintly of smoke for 3 days. But for Eli Graves, the locket was only the beginning, because when he returned to the jail that night, he found an entry in the old arrest ledger from December 1881. Name: unknown boy. Age: 10. Description: found wandering near burned chapel, unharmed. Attached was a sketch. The same boy, exactly the same face. Not aged a day, not burned, not afraid, just smiling. In the fire. December 3rd, 1881. The entry was almost erased, the ink blurred, the paper fragile as dried skin. But there it was, sandwiched between drunken disorderlies and cattle thefts. Unknown child, recovered at site of chapel fire, no injuries, detained for questioning. Sheriff Walter Brannock, younger back then, hadn't spoken of that night in over 30 years, but after the girl's death in 1911, something cracked in him. He invited Deputy Eli Graves into the station's cellar one evening and lit a single oil lamp. From a dust-choked trunk, he pulled out the sketch from that arrest file. It was the boy, same hair, same strange smile, same unnerving calm in his eyes. "He didn't say his name," Brannock whispered. "Didn't say much of anything. Just sat there while the chapel burned behind him." Eli leaned in. "The chapel? The one near Widow's Ridge?" Brannock nodded. "They said it collapsed in the fire." "No." Brannock shook his head slowly. "That's what we told the town. That's what we wanted them to believe." In truth, the chapel had not collapsed. It had remained standing, blackened, scorched, but whole. And in its center, the boy had been found sitting cross-legged before the altar, surrounded by fire. The pews had burned, the roof had cracked, but the flames never touched him. And when Brannock approached with his men, cautious, rifles drawn, the boy had looked up and spoken his first and only words that night. "I've been here before." That line, it had haunted Brannock for 3 decades, because when they took the boy into custody, fingerprinted him, asked for a name, he just smiled. And then he vanished. The door was locked. No one had come or gone, but when they checked the cell before dawn, it was empty. Nothing but soot on the floor, and a single line scratched into the wall. "He comes before the fire." Eli stared at the wall in silence. "And the cellar was cold. He could swear he smelled smoke. Old, sweet, like wood from a church long gone. 1913. Nearly 22 years after the chapel incident, a man named Ephraim Tolliver arrived at the Pine Hollow Sanitarium in Maine. He claimed he'd walked from Kansas barefoot, speaking only when asked, hands swaddled in bandages black with ash and blood. Dr. Agnes Bell, one of the few female psychiatrists operating at the time, was assigned to assess him. The first thing she noted was the smell, not the stench of rot, but the distinct scent of burned cedar and lamp oil that seemed to follow him even when freshly bathed. Tolliver refused to speak until one evening, unprompted, he muttered a single phrase. "The boy in the fire has no shadow." Agnes, unfamiliar with the phrase, wrote it off as delusion. But when she asked him to draw what he meant, he did, shakily, with a piece of charcoal on linen. The image chilled her, a small child, seated before a burning church with smoke rising in waves. Yet behind the child, no silhouette, just blank canvas where a shadow should have been. When shown to the orderlies, one elderly attendant dropped his tray. "That boy, that's the one who was on the cover of the Colorado Sentinel back in 11, the little prophet." Agnes, stunned, dug through archives and found the article. The same eyes, the same tilt of the head, even the same shirt. "How old was he in this photo?" she asked. They said 6. "And this was 2 years ago?" "Yep." Agnes stared at the drawing again. But the Tolliver sketch. The chapel fire was 1881. "Then either someone's lying," the orderly whispered, "or the boy never aged a day." That night, Tolliver screamed in his cell. The nurses found him convulsing, blood seeping from his bandages. On the wall, smeared in ash and skin, were the words, "The fire cannot take what it created." Tolliver died by morning. No visible injuries. But his hands were burned down to the bone, as if they'd just been pulled from the flames. In 1926, a New York collector named Reginald March purchased an estate lot from an abandoned seminary near the Hudson River. Among rusted bells, rotted hymnals, and portraits of long-forgotten priests, he found a painting wrapped in oilcloth and bound with twine. It was unsigned. The canvas was unvarnished. But what arrested Reginald most was the subject. A small boy, perhaps 6 years old, standing in a church aisle lit with strange, unnatural light. His eyes followed you, no matter where you moved. But what truly disturbed March was the year scrawled faintly in charcoal on the frame's back. 81. Curious and slightly unnerved, March had the painting examined by an expert in art preservation. The results were unsettling. "The oils are consistent with mid-1800s technique," the expert said. "But this canvas, it's not aging right. It's resisting decay." The real shock came 6 months later when March, growing more obsessed with the boy, decided to commission a photographic reproduction. The photographer used a new lens and long exposure. When the developed image came back, it was different. The boy's face, slightly older, his features lengthened, eyes heavier, expression more haunted, almost like he'd aged 3 or 4 years since the original painting. March assumed it was a trick of the lens or the lighting, but he checked again. He had the original scanned multiple times over the next few months. Each time, the boy was older. By the time March died in 1929, he had locked the painting inside a metal crate, bolted and sealed with wax. He left a note, scrawled in trembling ink. He knows he's being watched, and he watches back. Years later, that same crate was auctioned off under the vague label, "Religious item, unknown origin." Its buyer, a Catholic priest researching demonic possession in children. The painting resurfaced in 1964, but by then, the boy Anye in the portrait was 17. And yet, to every witness, it was always the same boy, same church, same firelight, same haunting, ageless stare. In the scorched remains of Rosebridge Orphanage, investigators discovered more than ash and sorrow. They found a cassette tape, labeled only with the date, October 14th, 1953, the same night the orphanage burned down, killing all 12 residents inside, except one. The lone survivor, a 6-year-old boy, had no name, no family, no known history. The orphanage log simply referred to him as Subject M. The tape was presumed lost for decades, but in 1997, it appeared at an estate sale in Providence, Rhode Island. A private collector bought it, unaware of what it contained. The audio was distorted, warped by time, but it captured a conversation between Sister Agnes Liddell, the orphanage's matron, and a visiting social worker. Social worker, voice trembling. "But sister, that child, he's been here for how long?" Sister Agnes, 21 years. Social worker, that can't be. He's still a boy. Sister Agnes, softly, he doesn't eat, doesn't sleep. The other children, they dream about fire when he's near. One girl jumped from the 3rd floor, said the boy told her she'd burn anyway. At that point in the recording, the tape picks up a strange hissing sound, like wind through dry grass. Then a child's voice, clear, monotone. Tell her what you saw last night." The social worker begins to weep. Sister Agnes says nothing. The tape ends with the sound of distant church bells, though no such church stood near Rosebridge for miles. The boy vanished the night of the fire. Investigators initially suspected arson but found no accelerant. Only traces of melted iron in the boy's empty bed frame, as if heat had originated from within. The same boy was later reported by firefighters in Boston, 1961, where a tenement blaze killed 16. They described a barefoot child watching from the alley, untouched by smoke, calmly whispering into the air. They said he smiled when the last wall collapsed. By the winter of 1967, the rumors had turned ritualistic. In small towns across the Northeast, places like Claremont, Bridge Hollow, and Elmswell Creek, children whispered about a boy in the smoke, a boy who watched houses burn, a boy who spoke only to fire, and it listened. The first formal report came from a fire captain named Louis Breck, stationed in rural Vermont. His crew responded to a barn blaze just outside Montpelier. The fire had started unnaturally fast, no lightning, no flammable materials, and no one living on the property since 1959. But Captain Breck saw something impossible. As his men fought the blaze, a shape appeared in the black smoke, not rising randomly like heat distortion, but forming, sharpening, staring. It was a boy, Breck told local reporters. Dark hair, no shirt, no shoes, just watching us. Not scared, not moving, just there. The fire didn't spread normally. It pulsed, as if inhaling, exhaling. One firefighter suffered 3rd-degree burns even though he never entered the building. Another collapsed from smoke inhalation 5 minutes after arriving, though his mask was intact. Local legend turned this into a campfire tale, the Ash Boy of Vermont, but the real documentation disappeared. All paper reports from that incident were lost in a municipal records fire in 1971. The same year, a group of Catholic missionaries recorded something strange in Perkins Asylum, an abandoned mental hospital used temporarily as a shelter. They described hearing a child speak through the firelight, despite no child being present. He repeated one line: "What is born of fire does not return to dust." That same night, the church shelter burned to the ground. 3 volunteers perished. 1 priest survived, though he never spoke again. He simply carved a circle into his hospital room wall every day for 8 years. Later, authorities confirmed something chilling. One of the volunteers who died that night had worked at Rosebridge Orphanage in 1953. Coincidence? Or something finishing what it started? By 1972, the Department of Interior quietly opened a task force under a civilian name, Firewatch Division 11. Officially, it was a wildfire prevention team. Unofficially, it was tracking a child who never grew old, seen in the periphery of over a dozen unexplained fires spanning 3 decades. Leading the investigation was Elliot Greaves, a former Army intelligence officer with a reputation for chasing non-standard anomalies, the kinds of things the government didn't admit existed. Greaves believed they weren't dealing with arson. He believed they were dealing with a fixed presence, a being that moved with fire like a parasite moves with its host. Greaves's team compiled a chilling dossier: photographs, heat signatures, burnt property records, and testimonies from survivors too rattled to form coherent sentences. Many of them described seeing the same boy, thin, around 8 years old, no burns, no scars, eyes either coal black or shimmering like embers, and always smiling faintly, as if he knew something they didn't. One photo became central to the file. It was taken by a hunter in Cedar Flats, Pennsylvania, seconds before his cabin went up in flames. He'd installed a wildlife camera that triggered from movement. The image it captured showed a child standing in the tree line, shirtless, barefoot in snow, and untouched by the frost. Behind him, trees were catching fire before the flames reached them. The image was time-stamped, 7:06 p.m. By 7:11 p.m., the cabin was gone. Greaves, increasingly paranoid, began drawing connections no one wanted to hear. He pointed to the fact that several government buildings that burned in odd circumstances had records tied to orphanage adoptions, fire insurance fraud, and, most disturbingly, classified military experiments involving child psychology and sensory isolation. Was the boy a victim, a byproduct, or something older? Oh, the entry from his private journal simply read, "He's not haunting the fire. He is the fire, and he wants to be seen." In 1974, Greaves disappeared. His last known location, a house in Elmswell Creek, the same house where the boy was first reported in 1947. The Elmswell house had long been condemned, boarded up, overgrown with thornweed, and left to rot by a town that feared its foundation. Locals spoke of strange lights at night, of voices drifting out of sealed windows, and of ash on the wind without a fire in sight. But in March of 1974, Elliot Greaves entered alone. He never came back out. A month later, his briefcase was found on the edge of a dried creek bed 2 miles away. Inside were tape recordings, 8 of them. The first 5 were dry, investigative field notes, building layout, electromagnetic anomalies, floorboard rot. But the last 3? They were terrifying. Tape 6 began with heavy breathing, then a whisper. "He's in the walls." Then came laughter, a child's voice, high, scratchy, and unnervingly calm. Greaves could be heard calling out, trying to reason, "I know you're not human, but I also know you're in pain. What do you want from us?" The boy's voice replied, "I want to be remembered." Tape 7 was mostly static, but at the 43-second mark, something deep and not human said a single word: witness. Tape 8 was blank, just the faint sound of crackling embers underneath complete silence. The contents of the tapes were quietly seized by Homeland Defense, but one copy survived, buried in the private archive of a now-deceased journalist named Harland Mays, who had briefly worked on a Cold War PSYOPs expose. In his notes, Mays claimed Greaves had gone mad, but the audio was not faked, not staged, and not of this world. More haunting was what fire inspectors found when they finally entered the Elmswell house again. The entire interior had been gutted by fire, but there were no signs of ignition. All the mirrors in the house were shattered outward, not inward, and on the wall of what had once been a child's room, burned into the plaster, were the words, "I burn because I remember," and "I remember because you forgot." Whatever Greaves found, it didn't want to be forgotten, and it was just getting started. By the summer of 1975, the town of Renton was beginning to unravel in quiet ways. The church bells no longer rang on time. The parishioners who once filled the pews began complaining of strange sensations during Sunday services: heat without fire, a child's voice singing during the sermon, and a persistent smell of smoke that clung to hymnals and skin alike. Reverend Thomas Calder, a man of rigid skepticism, decided to investigate the oldest section of the church's archives, buried deep beneath the bell tower. What he found shook even his iron faith. The parish record book, dating back to 1903, had been half consumed by fire, though the room had no electrical wiring or open flame. Several pages were burned clean through, but the pattern wasn't random. It was surgical. Every single record relating to orphans, stillbirths, or children placed in the care of the church between 1911 and 1914 was missing. Only one page remained untouched, though heavily smudged by ash. It bore a name: Elias Kinnard. Born unknown. Admitted August 17, 1912. Notes: unbaptized, silent, brings ash into the bedclothes. No date of death, no adoption records, no photo, just a signature at the bottom from Father Josiah Morell, a priest who'd been disgraced and excommunicated for unknown reasons in 1915, and who was found burned alive in his home shortly after. Calder, trembling with fear and faith alike, took the record to local authorities. Within 24 hours, the page had vanished. The file was deemed non-existent, and the archdiocese denied Father Morell had ever served. But Calder had already made copies. He began preaching sermons centered on remembrance of lost children, of ignored voices, of pain buried by faith. Attendance plummeted. Parishioners claimed his sermons were laced with madness, but a few stayed behind after each service, those who, like Calder, had heard the boy's voice. They formed a circle, small at first, then larger. They called themselves the Ash Remnant, and every time they gathered, candles flickered, even when unlit. She lived alone in a stone house on the northern ridge where the trees leaned unnaturally east as though pushed by a wind that had long since died. Edith Mornsby had survived 3 husbands, 2 house fires, and a fever that wiped out half the valley in 1946. The townsfolk called her the widow on the hill, but they never said it kindly. Not because of the rumors, though there were many, but because of the truth they felt and couldn't name. They said her windows cried at night, that candles lit themselves in her attic, and that she'd once kept a child who never aged. In the summer of 1976, the fire came again. It began in her garden, a perfect circle of blackened roses. The wind didn't blow, yet her weathercock spun. Edith, who hadn't stepped into town in years, came down barefoot to the Ash Remnant gathering on a stormless Tuesday. Her eyes were wet, not with grief, but with recognition. "He's awake again," she said softly, as if they'd all known who he was. "I smelled the sulfur in my kettle, heard him humming in the chimney." She held something wrapped in scorched linen, a small child's shoe, still warm to the touch, its sole unmarked by age or wear. Calder took it gently. Inside, he found a folded note in a childish, elegant hand. I remember them all. I keep what the fire spares." Edith explained slowly that in 1913 she had cared for a boy left at her doorstep. No name, just eyes that looked older than hers and a body that radiated dry heat even in winter. He never ate, never spoke, but at night she'd hear him praying in Latin, a language she didn't know. On the day he disappeared, every mirror in her home shattered. And then the dreams started. "He doesn't burn," she told Calder, staring out past the hill. "He makes others burn, for forgetting him." The circle fell silent, even Calder. Outside, the night wind carried ash that hadn't fallen in 50 years. Her name was Mara Elliott, and by 1991 she'd already tried to kill herself twice. Not because of drugs, not because of trauma, but because of the whispers. She lived with her aunt in a worn-out farmhouse behind the hollow birch grove, land that was always damp, no matter the season. Locals believed it was cursed soil, ever since the boy in the fire was seen there in 1913, moments before the largest lightning strike in county history split a birch tree clean in half. That tree still stood, charred and humming. Mara was just 13 when she started waking up outside, barefoot and frozen, her hands covered in soot she couldn't explain. Her aunt found symbols burned into the bark behind their house, circles, eyes, a boy's face. She started drawing him, dozens of sketches in charcoal, each more frantic than the last. "He never opens his mouth," she'd say, "but I still hear him." One morning, Mara vanished for 6 hours. When they found her, she was sitting calmly in front of the old birch stump, completely dry despite the pouring rain. She was smiling, but her eyes were glazed. They rushed her to St. Mark's Infirmary, where doctors said her core body temperature was 3 degrees higher than normal, yet she wasn't sick. She wouldn't speak for 3 days. Then suddenly, "His hands don't have lines," she whispered. "Just flame, like cracks in the earth." She'd met him. She claimed he came from a hole in the air, where time was a spiral and voices moved backward. He told her about the valley, about the judgment that would come, about the remembering. She told doctors he was not angry, only forgotten, and when the town finally gave him a name, something untrue would be born. "His real name is buried," she said, "and when it's dug up, no one will sleep again." After that, Mara stopped speaking entirely. She was placed in psychiatric care. The file reads, "Possessed" or "Prodigal." But the nurse on duty, Evelyn Griggs, wrote one final line in her notes before quitting the same week. "When I stood near Mara, I felt warm, like I was being watched by a fireplace that remembered me. It was Father Malcolm Rains who first connected the boy's appearances to fire. Not symbolically, literally. The small stone church of St. Gabriel's sat near the outskirts of town, just beyond the tree line, with warped wooden pews and a leaky roof. The kind of church where silence felt like a secret being kept. Father Rains had led sermons there for 32 years, watched children grow, buried their parents, baptized newborns in a cracked marble basin that had never been moved. In October of 1994, he opened the chapel for early prayer and found soot in the holy water. Not a speck, a thin layer, like the aftermath of something smoldering. The next morning, he found more. And the morning after that, embers, floating. He told no one, until the Sunday of the fire. It started in the back office, only 4 square meters, but when the firemen arrived, they swore the blaze behaved unnaturally, curling around the crucifix but not burning it. The church didn't collapse. It changed. Stone darkened, wood warped inward, but nothing was destroyed. That same day, Father Rains reported something chilling to the diocese. He had seen a boy in the smoke, not running, not fleeing, standing, watching. In a white shirt, barefoot, eyes reflecting light like a cat's. And behind him, a whisper. He doesn't fear flames because he doesn't remember pain. The bishop dismissed it as trauma-induced hallucination. But Father Rains had proof, a photo taken during the fire's aftermath, charred wall, twisted altar, and a child-sized shadow with no source. 3 days later, the priest was found unconscious inside the church, curled in the fetal position in front of the baptismal font. His palms were blackened like he'd held burning coals, but the water was still cool. His final written words, scrawled in the margin of a sermon. He is older than the church, and still the church fears him. After that, Father Rains retired and moved to a mountain convent in silence. He no longer prays with fire near. Because fire, he says, listens. In the early spring of 1997, a local journalist named Eli Mercer began digging through archived stories for an anniversary piece on old town disasters. He was young, ambitious, too curious for his own good. While reviewing photos of past fires in the Pine Hollow region, Eli began to notice something uncanny. The same boy. In the background of 5 separate images across 4 decades, standing near a barn engulfed in flames, watching a schoolhouse smolder, staring at the remains of a diner that exploded in 1969. Always the same face, same white shirt, same glassy expression. Not older, not younger, unchanged. Eli became obsessed. He printed them all, pinned them on his office wall, and marked the locations with red string like a madman charting the path of a ghost. He shared his findings with his editor, who laughed. Creepy, sure, but probably just coincidence. Some local kid in the wrong place at the wrong time. But Eli dug deeper. He visited the families of the fire victims, interviewed survivors. One man swore the boy warned him not to enter the building 10 minutes before it blew. A woman remembered him standing barefoot in snow, watching her parents' house burn. He wasn't just there. He arrived before it happened. One night, Eli set up a motion-activated camera outside a condemned boarding school that had long been rumored to be the boy's last known sighting. The place had been boarded up for years, supposedly haunted, but more likely filled with squatters and decay. At 3:14 a.m., the camera snapped a photo. It showed the courtyard, dim and still, but in the far left corner, there he was. The boy. Same expression, same white shirt, but something was wrong. His eyes were glowing faintly, and a flame hovered just above his open palm. The next morning, the building was gone, burned to the ground, no signs of forced entry. Eli's footage corrupted, but the photo, that survived. And Eli? He never published the story. 2 weeks later, he left town without a word, his desk empty, his apartment abandoned, and on the wall of his office, one sentence scratched into plaster with something sharp. He doesn't start fires, he remembers them. In 2005, long after the Pine Hollow incidents had faded from public memory, a woman named Clara Wendell, age 82, passed away in a quiet coastal town in Maine. She had lived alone for decades in a weathered house surrounded by salt-bleached fences and bitter wind. Her neighbors called her odd but harmless, a widow who kept to herself and mailed letters that never had return addresses. After her death, a caretaker cleaning out her attic found a leather-bound journal brittle with age, its pages inked with precise handwriting. The title written on the inside cover was simple, "The Boy Who Knows the End." It began in 1944 with Clara, then just 21, recounting the fire that took her fiancé in an ammunition factory explosion. She wrote about the smoke, the screams, the chaos. But what haunted her most wasn't the flames. It was the boy in white, standing motionless in the field beyond the barbed fence, watching it all, silent, unmoving. I should have been terrified, she wrote, but I wasn't. I felt forgiven. As the journal progressed, Clara detailed sightings of the boy every 7 years, always during tragedy, always before fire. She described trying to follow him once in 1951, through ash-filled woods after a forest blaze, only to lose sight of him when the fog rolled in. In 1965, she moved to a small town near the sea, believing distance would break the pattern. But it didn't. One foggy morning, she opened her front door and found a single child's footprint scorched into her porch. That night, a fishing vessel exploded offshore. 6 dead. The boy had been seen that day walking alone along the marina. Clara's final entries grew erratic. She spoke of dreams where the boy stood in a ring of fire, reciting the names of those about to die. She once claimed he looked at her and whispered, "You're the last page, Clara, and you're almost written." The final entry reread, "He isn't real, but neither is death. One of them just wears a face we can bear to look at." The journal was never claimed by any family. It now sits in a private collection, sealed in a vault beneath the main folklore archive. Scholars are forbidden to publish its content. But every 7 years, someone requests to view it, and after each visit, another fire. In the winter of 2012, the town of Ashfield, Vermont experienced a tragedy that shook the quiet mountain community to its core. 3 homes, all on the same street, burned to the ground in a span of just 48 hours. The fire department ruled it a freak electrical issue, some surge in the old power grid due to the snowstorm. But for many of Ashfield's older residents, it brought back a chilling memory from 1985. Because in 85, the exact same 3 houses burned, same addresses, same sequence, same time of year, and in both cases, no one died. In 1985, Eleanor McGrew, the only survivor of the first wave of fires, claimed she had seen a child standing barefoot in the snow, watching the flames with glassy, unblinking eyes. She described him as wearing a dark coat too big for his frame, hair slicked back like a photograph from the 1920s. In 2012, her granddaughter, Lena, said she saw him too. According to her interview, given just days after the blaze, she said, "He stood there while the fire ate everything. I screamed for him to move. He just turned and looked at me. His face didn't match his eyes. His eyes were old." Local authorities dismissed the accounts, calling it collective trauma, a psychological echo. But a journalist named Darren Bell, who had grown up in Ashfield and returned to cover the 2012 event, noticed something no one else had. In the fire marshal's photos, barely visible through the smoke in the background of all 3 properties, was the same silhouette. A child, standing alone, same height, same posture, same place relative to the blaze. Bell became obsessed. He dug into town records, visited neighboring fire stations, even traveled back to Pine Hollow. Everywhere he went, people shut their doors. Files were missing. Photos gone. One station had burned down in 1993. He compiled everything into a private blog titled The Ember Watcher, a memoir. A few people ever read it before it was taken down in 2014. Bell disappeared that same year. His apartment was found empty, except for a single item on his desk, a child's drawing. A stick figure boy, red crayon flames all around him, and a note scrawled below, "He doesn't burn. We do." In 2015, a defunct roadside motel just outside Pine Hollow, abandoned since the late 90s, was purchased by a real estate group planning to renovate it into a ski lodge. During cleanup, contractors discovered a stack of dusty VHS tapes in the back office. Most were blank or contained old security footage, but one tape stood out, marked only with a charcoal smear shaped like a handprint. The footage was dated March 4th, 1991. It showed a snowy night, dimly lit by a flickering security lamp near room 6. Timecode glitches made parts of the footage stutter, but one segment remained intact. A man named Henry Blass, a traveling salesman staying for the night, is seen exiting his room to smoke. At 2:23 a.m., a child appears in the frame. He steps out from the shadows near the tree line, barefoot in the snow, arms stiff at his side. Henry notices him, confused, then begins walking toward him. And then, the tape distorts. For exactly 38 seconds, the screen buzzes with a high-pitched whine. When the footage resumes, the child is gone. Henry is flat on his back, limbs splayed unnaturally, as if he had fallen from a great height. Smoke begins curling from under his shirt. His clothes don't ignite. They blacken and crumple as if touched by acid. His last motion before death, he points, barely lifting his hand toward the camera. The feed cuts out. Police were contacted, but when they viewed the tape later that week, it had degraded. No image, no sound. The handprint label had also faded. Now just a blur. Authorities called it a hoax. The motel was eventually bulldozed. But Jason Mallory, the contractor who found the tape, uploaded a still frame to Reddit days before deleting his account. It shows Henry's figure, faint, and behind him, the blurry form of a boy, barefoot, watching. The post was flagged for disturbing content. Mallory never posted again. 6 months later, his house in Burlington burned to the ground, no survivors. And in the police body cam footage recorded that night, paused at the 3-minute mark, a frame captured a child's face in the reflection of the firefighter's helmet, grinning. In the fall of 1967, in a quiet riverside town called Marrow Creek, locals remembered a man named Silas Venn, an elderly recluse known for crafting unsettling dolls. His workshop sat behind a sagging 2-story house, filled wall to wall with porcelain figures, their painted faces always twisted just slightly wrong. Children whispered that the dolls blinked when you weren't looking. Adults avoided the place altogether. But Silas never harmed anyone. He rarely left the property and only spoke at the general store twice a month when buying varnish and paint. Then came the fire. On October 12th, neighbors saw smoke rising from Silas's attic. Fire crews were called, but by the time they arrived, the workshop was fully engulfed. Silas was presumed dead, though no remains were ever recovered. What investigators did find, however, chilled them to the core. Dozens of dolls, untouched by flame, circled the workshop's center. Every single one had been turned to face the same direction, the attic window, their painted eyes staring outward. On the window's broken frame, scorched into the wood, were the faint outlines of bare feet, and across the ash-covered floor was a message scratched in burnt lacquer. He comes for the fire that forgets. A week later, a grieving mother named Lorna Gibbons came forward. Her daughter, Ellie, had owned a custom doll made by Silas, a gift for surviving a childhood illness. But the night of the fire, Lorna claimed Ellie had woken up screaming, pointing at the wall. She kept repeating, "He's in the paint." Ellie never spoke again. The doll? Gone. The shelf where it sat had been scorched black, and a single child-sized footprint was found in the soot beneath it. Local legend says Silas never died. Not really. That something ancient wore his skin and used the dolls as conduits, but those who truly believe in the legend insist it was Aunt Silas who built them. It was the boy. The same boy seen at fires, the same child who watches from corners, from reflections, and walks barefoot where no footprints should survive. In 1974, just 7 years after the Marrow Creek fire, an art therapist named Joanna Ellis moved to a children's psychiatric center in Grimley Hollow, a secluded forest town in Maine. The center had recently taken in a deeply disturbed boy named Daniel, a foster child found wandering alone after a barn fire that claimed the lives of his adoptive family. He never spoke, not a single word, but he drew, constantly, in charcoal, crayon, sometimes just burnt wood if no tools were given, always the same image. A small boy, eyes blacked out, standing near flame. At first, Joanna assumed the drawings were self-portraits, perhaps his way of processing trauma. But as weeks passed, the sketches grew more detailed, more violent. One showed the small boy watching a house burn. Another depicted a woman holding a baby, engulfed in smoke. The strangest part? Every fire he drew eventually happened. At first, no one connected it. But after a volunteer's home burned down, days after appearing in one of Daniel's drawings, Joanna began to document them all. Within 6 months, 7 separate fires occurred, all eerily similar to the art. When she brought this to the head of the center, she was dismissed, labeled superstitious, overworked. She was told Daniel would be transferred to a more secure facility, but he never arrived. The transport van carrying Daniel veered off the road on a rain-slicked cliffside. The bodies of the driver and assistant were recovered. Daniel's seatbelt was buckled, but the seat was empty. They found a drawing, though, folded into the driver's coat pocket. It showed the very crash, days before it happened, and in the lower right-hand corner, a faint figure, barefoot, smiling faintly, watching from behind a tree. Joanna disappeared from public record 3 weeks later, her home found abandoned, her sketchbook open on the table, the last page drawn in black ash. A boy, standing in firelight, holding a burned doll. In 1982, an investigative journalist named Martin Hale began a private inquiry into what he believed was a series of orphan fires, incidents where unaccompanied children were present at or near house fires, then vanished before questioning. His trail led him across 8 states, hundreds of miles, and into a pattern so exact, so chilling, he described it in his personal diary as not arson, not accidents, but announcements. Martin compiled a red leather ledger filled with his findings, police reports, school records, eyewitness statements, and dozens of photographs. The disturbing common thread? A boy between 9 and 11 years old, always seen before tragedy struck, always unclaimed, always missing after. One black and white photo haunted him most, taken at a school fire drill in 1969. Dozens of students facing the camera, except one. A child at the edge of the crowd, turned away, head slightly tilted, shirt half burnt. His presence wasn't noted by anyone present that day. Martin tracked that same face, unchanged, in a 1955 farm photo, a 1993 street market surveillance reel, even a 2006 security cam at a daycare that burned down 2 days later. Same eyes, same hair, same height. He interviewed a firefighter who'd seen the boy on a rooftop in Illinois just minutes before a 3-alarm blaze. When questioned, the man trembled and said, "That kid looked right through me, like he knew where I'd be buried." Martin's obsession grew. His apartment became a maze of string-connected photos, burning timelines, and marked maps. But before he could publish his findings, his apartment caught fire. He didn't make it out. Investigators later found a charred red notebook and a child's drawing in the center. A man at a desk, surrounded by flame. A boy outside the window, smiling. And on the final page of the ledger, written in a shaky hand, was a single sentence: He doesn't age because he never left the fire. The firemen who arrived at Martin Hale's apartment were unprepared for what they found. The flames were out, yet the air still hung heavy with a suffocating heat. The building had been scorched beyond recognition, yet Hale's apartment, the very epicenter of the blaze, seemed untouched. No soot, no ashes, no damage. Only the charred remains of Hale's desk where his red ledger had once sat. Yet, amidst the untouched room lay something far more chilling. A child's handprint, burnt into the surface of Hale's desk. The shape was unmistakable, a small, fragile hand, as if the boy had reached through the flames itself. The child's smile stared up at the investigators, frozen in time. The authorities couldn't explain it. They couldn't explain the lack of evidence pointing to any arsonist, nor the disturbing coincidence of Hale's death in the same fire that he had so obsessively investigated. But one thing they couldn't ignore: the presence of the boy. Forensic analysis found a match with the same boy who had appeared in photographs from earlier tragedies. His fingerprints were found in Hale's files, despite there being no record of him ever physically touching any document. As investigators dug deeper into Hale's past, they uncovered traces of the boy's shadow, haunting old records of firemen, children's hospitals, and orphanages, places where a child fitting the same description had appeared again and again, only to disappear when the fires began. Then came the dream. Dr. Olivia Benton, the lead psychiatrist on the case, found herself consumed by strange visions that had begun to plague her nights. In one particularly vivid dream, she saw Hale's face, but it was not the face of a man consumed by fire. Instead, it was a young boy's face, standing amidst a raging inferno, smiling as if he were watching a performance. Not a victim, but a spectator. She awoke in a cold sweat, unable to shake the feeling that the boy in the flames was somehow controlling the fire. Driven by these visions, Dr. Benton continued to pursue her research into Hale's files, determined to uncover the connection. That was when she stumbled upon a series of unexplained deaths, all tied to unsolved fire cases dating back to the early 1900s. The same faces appeared over and over again, the same child, growing older with each case, but never aging. Finally, after months of study, Dr. Benton came to a terrifying conclusion. The boy was no mere ghost. He was the manifestation of fire itself, an entity that had existed for as long as the flames. His presence was the spark, a force that ignited the destruction that followed. Her conclusion led her to one chilling thought. The boy couldn't die, because he was fire personified, eternally bound to it. He was the source of every fire, every tragedy, every unanswered death. As Dr. Benton prepared her final report, her office was engulfed in flames. Her body was never found, but her research, her theories, disappeared without a trace. And as the flames spread across her building, there, in the smoke, was a small child's handprint burned into the window. It was clear. He was always watching, always waiting. The fire at Dr. Benton's office was ruled an accident. Faulty wiring, paper stacks, old equipment. The explanation was neat, painless, convenient. But those who had seen her the week before the fire knew better. She had changed, visibly haunted, muttering to herself, sketching symbols and circles on napkins during lunch, asking strange questions like, "Can a soul catch fire?" or "What if flame remembers?" Among her surviving possessions, found locked in a fireproof safe deep beneath the rubble, was a torn notebook. The pages were half burnt, but what remained was disturbing enough to rattle even the most hardened agents. Scribbled in ink were dozens of entries detailing cases of combustion without source, childlike figures seen near open flames, and patterns in death reports, all pointing to the same birth date, listed over a span of 130 years. On the final, intact page were just 4 words. "He knows my name." Those words echoed in the mind of Detective Rourke, the last person assigned to review Benton's case. He was no stranger to horror. He'd worked child disappearances, homicide, arson. But this? This felt like a trap built not of clues, but of omens. He didn't believe in ghosts. Until now. Rourke began connecting dots. There was the St. Linus Orphanage fire in 1923, where no staff survived but 2 eyewitnesses. Both swore they saw a boy standing in the middle of the hallway, untouched by flame. Then, the Newark Library blaze of 1951, where the fire's origin was traced to a sealed archive room. Investigators found singed drawings of a boy with fire in his hands. And then, the Hollow Pines Church fire of 1987, which consumed 47 people during a Sunday sermon. One survivor claimed to have followed a child outside, a boy who smiled and said, "They'll be warm soon." The boy was always present, but never listed among the dead. Rourke's obsession grew. He ordered thermal scans of unburnt crime scenes, requested infrared reconstructions. He found residual heat signatures in patterns that resembled fingerprints, handprints, and, in one case, a perfectly symmetrical child's face burnt into the floor of an empty hallway. The forensic team dismissed it as pareidolia. Rourke wasn't so sure. One night, reviewing the archived audio logs from Benton's interviews, Rourke heard something he hadn't noticed before. It wasn't a voice. It was a giggle, high-pitched, faint, under the static. He reversed the audio. The giggle transformed into a whisper. It said, "I remember you." The next day, Rourke disappeared. His apartment was found scorched, though no fire had occurred. On the wall was a message, charred into the plaster, spelled in blackened soot. "You looked too long." The case was closed, but the stories, they only grew. There's a house in Cape Vale, near the jagged cliffs where the sea crashes like a warning. The locals won't speak of it. Not anymore. They say it's just wind you hear at night, not the voice of a child singing lullabies from the attic. They say the fire that claimed the house in 1901 was put out. But sometimes they still see light flickering in the windows. Orange, pulsing, like breath. The house has been abandoned for over a century, but its door is never locked. Inside, everything smells like smoke and salt. The wallpaper is bubbled and blackened, yet no fire brigade ever arrived. In the parlor, children's shoes sit neatly by the hearth. Upstairs, in the nursery, the walls are covered in handprints, tiny coal-gray palms smeared like warnings. And in the attic, among broken toys and the burnt cradle, there's a scorched circle on the floor, charred into the wood like a seal. No one who enters that attic stays long. Some say they hear breathing, others laughter. A few have sworn they saw him, the boy, crouched in the corner with eyes like embers, watching, waiting. The current legend, passed in whispers, says he only comes when you believe. That once you start following the stories, reading too far, chasing the deaths, trying to draw the line between coincidence and curse, that's when he sees you. That's when the air around you starts to shift, gets warmer. That's when matches spark without striking, when candles light in your sleep, when you hear footsteps, barefoot and small, circling your bed. The last known footage of the boy was recovered from a burnt VHS tape found in a flooded basement near Charleston. The footage is degraded, but analysts enhanced a single frame, a pale child looking directly into the lens, eyes glowing red-orange, mouth curled into a smile. The timestamp read, 4:04 a.m., tomorrow. and beneath it, faint and flickering, were 3 final words, burned into the final frame. Your next friend.